Dear Dr. Joe Dispenza, welcome to our Science and Knowledge TV program. Tell us what is neuroplasticity and how does the brain recognize an image? You have a very amazing and relevant picture, if you allow me to show it, from your book entitled Evolve Your Brain.
Sure. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to make new synaptic connections. And they used to think that the brain, science used to think that the brain was hardwired, meaning that we're born with certain propensities and we're going to be like that for the rest of our lives. But we are, in fact, marvels of adaptability and change. And so as you begin to think differently, as you begin to act differently, as you begin to choose differently, as you begin to create new experiences, the brain begins to rewire itself and create new neural pathways that become the very substructures of who we become. So plasticity then affords us the ability to change throughout our entire lives. And that continues through any age, even people later in their years. So the brain is not hardwired in any way. It's very much able to change and reroute connections.
Please tell us more about the chemistry of survival.
Well, living in stress is living in survival. And stress is when your body is knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body is knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. Now, for the most part, we have three types of stress. We have physical stress like trauma, accidents, injuries, falls. We have chemical stress like viruses, bacteria, mold, toxins, blood sugar levels. And we have emotional stress like family tragedies, finances, traffic, internet connections, mortgages. And all three of those things, whether they're physical, chemical, and emotional, knock the brain and body out of balance. Now, all organisms in nature can tolerate short-term stress. If a deer is in the woods and it's grazing, and all of a sudden it sees a pack of coyotes, the moment the deer perceives some threat in its external environment, it turns on a primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system. And the moment that sympathetic nervous system is switched on, the animal goes into survival and it's stressed. And all of a sudden, the body begins to mobilize enormous amounts of energy so that it can adapt to some threat in its external environment. So the pupils dilate, the salivary juices shut off, respiratory rate increases, heart rate increases, digestive glands close down, blood is sent to the extremities, glucose is mobilized, and the body is prepared for some threat in the external environment. Now, if the deer outruns the coyotes, 15 minutes later, it returns back to grazing, the event is over, and the body moves back to balance and homeostasis. Now, that's very adaptive because you need to mobilize all of that energy to survive, and it creates a certain amount of stress. And so that short-term stress, all organisms in nature can tolerate short-term stress. But what if it's a coworker? What if it's an in-law? What if it's a family member? And you keep turning on that stress response because you're perceiving your coworker, you're perceiving an in-law, you're perceiving a family member as if they were a pack of coyotes. Now, what was once very adaptive all of a sudden becomes very maladaptive. Because when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for disease. Because no organism can live in survival mode or emergency mode for extended periods of time. Because as you mobilize all of this energy for some threat in your external environment, there's no energy in your internal environment for growth and repair. There's no energy for long-term building projects. There's no energy to restore the body back to balance because we've mobilized and used the majority of it in survival. So then what makes it so unique is that human beings, because of the size of the neocortex and the frontal lobe, we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone. You can think about your problems. You can think about what happened yesterday. You can begin to worry about something that's going to happen tomorrow. And by thought, you can turn on the same stress response as if you were being chased by a pack of coyotes. And so then, as we turn on the stress response by thought alone, the very chemicals of stress give the brain and body a rush of energy, a rush of adrenaline. And that rush of energy and rush of adrenaline causes us to become addicted to those very chemicals. We become junkies to those very chemicals. And so then we begin to use the problems and conditions in our life to reaffirm our emotional addictions. The poor relationship, the bad job, the news, finances, whatever. We keep turning on that stress response just so that we can get a rush of adrenaline. And so then an addiction is something you can't stop. And so the emotions of anger, frustration, violence, war, hostility, fear, anxiety, worry, sadness, pain, guilt, unworthiness, suffering, depression, they're all created by the hormones of stress. And psychology calls those normal human states of consciousness. Those are altered states of consciousness. And so it's a scientific fact that the hormones of stress downregulate genes to create disease. And I just said that we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, which means then your thoughts could make you sick. So the question is, if your thoughts could make you sick, is it possible then that your thoughts could make you well? And if the very chemicals of stress mobilize all this energy to cause us to become addicted to that rush of adrenaline, and we can turn on the stress response by thought alone, is it possible that we become addicted to our own thoughts? And if we use the conditions in our life to reaffirm our emotional addictions, is it possible that we become addicted to the very life that doesn't work for us? So then as people begin to become aware that they're living in survival, for the most part, on a minimum 70% of the time in their lives, then all of a sudden now when they begin to make changes for themselves, just like an addict who's overcoming heroin or overcoming some drug, there's going to be some withdrawal because the body has been conditioned emotionally. So as the person begins to make those changes, their body goes into a little bit of disturbance because the body is looking for the very chemicals to reaffirm their identity. And so the work that we do teaches people how to lower the volume to those emotional states. And it is the process of being able to temper those emotions and begin to overcome them that literally frees the brain and body from being in the past. So most people overutilize the survival systems and they're overstressed. And for the most part, 75 to 90% of every person that walks into a healthcare facility in the Western world walks in because of some type of psychological or emotional stress. And it's that psychological and emotional stress that begins to break the body down. And reason this with me. If you keep turning on the fight or flight nervous system and you keep mobilizing enormous amounts of energy for some threat in your external environment, the very chemicals of cortisol and adrenaline begin to weaken the immune system. So you can have everything from cancer to MS, to rheumatoid arthritis, to lupus, because that stress response begins to suppress the immune system and people develop autoimmune diseases. You keep on turning the fight or flight nervous system on, your heart starts to race because, primitively speaking, you're being chased by some predator. Well, if you keep turning that on for an extended period of time, your heart will begin to race on its own. And blood pressure goes up, people have arrhythmias, they have tachycardia, because they're switched on that sympathetic system. If you keep turning on the fight or flight nervous system and you're mobilizing all this energy to your external limbs and you're shutting down blood flow and energy to your internal organs. You could eat the most organic, vegetarian, healthy food, but your body is not in the proper state to even break that food down because it's not a time to digest when you're being chased by a tiger. If you have infertility and problems with sexual organs, because if you're turning on that fight or flight nervous system, it's not a time for long-term building projects. It's not a time to grow a baby. It's not a time to procreate because there's danger out there. And I can go on and pretty much name most conditions, pain in the body. 80% of people in the Western world experience some type of back pain or musculoskeletal pain. Well, when you mobilize all this adrenaline and you're not using it to run and you keep that adrenaline released into the body, it makes its way into the tissues and it hardens the tissues. And over time, people develop spasms and contractions and pain, and it's all created by the chemicals of stress. And I could go on, but for the most part, it's those very chemicals that begin to break the brain and body down. And teaching people how to overcome their stress response and to be able to mediate it and regulate it is where the change really begins.
This is also linked with the next chapter of your book, chapter 9, the chemistry of emotional addiction.
Yes. Well, in my definition of an addiction is something that you can't stop. And the moment you perceive a threat in your external environment, real or imagined, the moment that thought signals the limbic brain and the limbic brain starts that process, the moment that occurs, all of a sudden your perception will be altered. And as your perception is altered, you're in a state to either run, fight, or hide. And people spend the majority of their time living in this state. And they're either aggressive, they're guilty, or they're suffering, or they're hiding in fear. And so teaching people how to get beyond the very chemicals of survival allows them to live healthier and better lives.
When I read through the book, I learned that a clear intention and an elevated emotion produce some pretty significant physical, biological effects. Can you explain this concept for our viewers a bit further?
Well, we talked about those emotions of survival, all of those limited emotions from hatred to anger to frustration to guilt to shame, unworthiness, fear, anxiety. Those are all created by the hormones of stress. And that's when we begin to draw energy from a body's vital field and we turn it into chemistry, and the very field around our body begins to diminish. Now we are more matter than less energy, more particle in quantum physics, less wave. And now we begin to become matter trying to change matter because the very chemicals of survival force us to become materialists, defining reality with our senses. And so when we feel more like matter and less like energy, we're always going to try to force outcomes in our life, control outcomes in our life, predict outcomes in our life, compete for outcomes in our life, because we're matter trying to change matter. This very principle of living this way for an extended period of time then begins to tax the body and draw its vital field of energy from it. So then when you begin to switch from those emotions to heart-centered emotions, emotions like gratitude, kindness, appreciation, thankfulness, care, compassion, inspiration, you begin to activate a very different center in the body. And when you activate this center, you go from a state of selfishness, because when we're in survival, we're only concerned about ourselves, to a level of selflessness, where all of a sudden now you begin to contribute energy to your very field. And the field around your body, the magnetic field around your body, tends to become enhanced. And so the elevated emotion is something that you can teach people to do, and we've done it. And as they begin to create an elevated emotion, and they're trained on how to do that, they begin to change the body's physiology from a level of survival to a level of creation. And so as they're moving out of their anger and moving out of their fear and moving out of their guilt and suffering, into an elevated emotion that's a heart-centered emotion, they begin to contribute to the field around the body. And the field around the body tends to become amplified. And as they sustain that emotional state, it's like dropping a pebble in water. It begins to create very strong electromagnetic energy. That magnetic field that's created is a frequency. So that frequency then carries information. And as they begin to put a clear intention in their mind with an elevated emotion, they begin to change the very energy that surrounds their body. Now, not only are they changing their energy or changing their consciousness or their thoughts and their feelings, but in addition to that, they're beginning to change the very neurocircuitry in their brain. They're beginning to change the very neuropeptides that are beginning to change the hormones that are secreted in their body. It's the very neuropeptides that have new information that begin to genetically or epigenetically signal new genes to make new chemicals and new proteins. And all of a sudden now the person begins to do something really amazing. They begin to change their very biology. And we did an experiment in February of this year where we took 120 students in an advanced workshop that we did. And we know that the chemicals of stress suppress the immune system. So we said, okay, let's take 120 people and measure their cortisol levels, which are their stress hormone levels, and let's measure their immune response, and we'll measure a chemical called IgA, immunoglobulin A, or salivary immunoglobulin A. So as cortisol levels go up, IgA levels go down. That's a scientific fact. But our hypothesis was, what if we create elevated emotions and they're able to sustain elevated emotions instead of survival emotions, just for 10 minutes a day, 3 times a day? Would their immune response go up and their cortisol levels go down, survival system shuts down, and their immune system in growth and repair tends to be enhanced? And at the end of 4 days, when we measured 120 students, their cortisol levels went down 3 standard deviations, which is very significant. But their IgA levels went from 55 up to 87, which is very clinically significant. That means that they were literally epigenetically signaling different genes to make different proteins. So even 10 minutes of gratitude a day, just for a few days, will begin to create a stronger, healthier immune system. And IgA is the primary defense against bacteria and viruses. So a clear intention involves a mindful process, and an elevated emotion requires a bodily process. And I say that thoughts are electric in the quantum field and feelings are magnetic. And how you think and how you feel broadcasts an electromagnetic signature that influences every single area of your life. So getting people to resonate in a different energy and to be able to sustain those states not only will change their health and their biology, but they should begin to see shifts take place in their lives.
How does the quantum model of reality work with the placebo?
Well, what makes the placebo so unique is you're using a pill to influence people to see possibility, to view a new possibility about themselves and their lives by thought alone. Now, the quantum field is an invisible field of intelligence that exists beyond this space and time. There's no objects there, there's no people there, there's no things there, there's no matter there. It's an immaterial field of light and information. And so it's the realm of possibility, and possibility is thought. So when a person begins to be introduced to a placebo, when they're introduced to the placebo is a symbol of possibility. They're selecting a new possibility in the quantum field. They don't know they're doing that, but they're thinking differently, like, I think I can get better, or this should help me, or I'm looking forward to playing with my grandchildren again, or gosh, maybe I can go on that vacation, or maybe I won't limp anymore. As they begin to image in their mind a new outcome, that's called a clear intention. And so then Intention does nothing to change the quantum field. Intention is one element. You're selecting a possibility. But when you combine that clear intention with an elevated emotion or an elevated energy, so to speak, it's that elevated emotion and elevated energy that begins to change the very biology of our body. So then, as they embrace that future, and the thought in their mind becomes the experience, the end product of an experience is called a feeling or an emotion. And all of a sudden now, the person begins to change their state of being. And if they keep revisiting that every day, because placebo studies, by the way, aren't just one sugar pill. In placebo studies, they have to take the placebo sometimes for 6 or 8 weeks. And that placebo then keeps reminding them of the future possibility. So in our work, we instruct people how to move into a new state of being and how to combine the clear intention with an elevated emotion and access an unknown in the quantum field and revisit it over and over again for weeks until it becomes a known, just like instead of taking an external substance, they're selecting that possibility without using anything outside of them.
How is it possible to make your inner experience of thoughts and feelings more real than an outer past experience? What does that to do us physically?
Well, what you don't know is that you do that all the time anyway. The privilege of a human being, because of the size of the forebrain, the size of the frontal lobe, is that we can make thought more real than anything else. That's the privilege. So if you're driving down the freeway in your car, and all of a sudden, as you're driving down the freeway, you start daydreaming, and all of a sudden you forget that you have a body. You forget about the road in front of you, the car that you're driving. You forget about time. Your inner world is becoming more real than your outer world. And like a movie screen, like a picture, a scene opens up, and for the most part, you're in that scene. And that kind of fascination, that kind of focused attention begins to fool the brain into believing what's going on between the person's ears is more real than what's going on in their outer world. And the brain captures the thought as the experience and begins to lay down the very circuitry to reflect that idea. So now the person is beginning to change their brain to look like the experience has already occurred, because to them the experience is more real than their outer world. If the thought becomes the experience in their mind, then all of a sudden they'll start to feel the emotion of that experience. Now this can work for us, or it could work against us. So if you're driving down the road in your car and you're thinking about going to work and telling off your coworker, or arguing with your boss, or writing a nasty email, or facing off with a team of people that don't like your ideas, whatever it is, as you begin to rehearse in your mind the scenes, and you're beginning to experience the emotions that go along with it, because the thought that you're thinking is the experience, by the time you get to work, you could be angry, you could be aggressive, you could be frustrated, you could be bitter, you could be judgmental, because you changed your brain and body in preparation of that event, but you did that by thought alone. Now, the actual opposite is possible too. If you began to image yourself feeling healthy and doing the things that you love to do, and beginning to see yourself in the same way, living a healthy life, and you began to emotionally embrace what it would feel like if you were that way, is it possible then you could do the antithesis of what you did in the first example? Could you change your brain and body to begin to become more healthy and feel more emotionally balanced and begin to release different chemicals in your brain and body that would begin to repair and regenerate your physical structures? And the answer is absolutely yes. But the majority of time, people are always anticipating the worst thing that's going to happen in their life based on what happened in their past. And so when they're living in survival and they're living in these states, they're selecting the worst case scenario and getting ready for it, because if anything less happens, they have better chances of survival. So we want people to do the exact opposite. We want them to begin to obsess about the best thing that could happen to them, and when they get the training on how to do this, they can begin to change their brain and body and begin to produce more positive effects than negative effects.
Please tell us more about neurons and the nervous system. Traveling the original information superhighway. What do you mean by that?
Well, what most people don't know is that your nervous system is receiving and sending information all the time. That your nervous system really is the superconductor or the semiconductor of consciousness. And you're always either receiving information or sending information. And so most people are using their senses to define reality, because we have senses that plug us into reality. The more the person is living in survival Christian, the more they are perceiving reality with their senses, the more they're a materialist. The more they feel separate from the quantum field, they feel like reality is right in front of them. So the more addicted they are to the stress hormones, in fact, the more they are materialists, and this is where reality takes place. So the brain is etching and mapping information neurologically from experiences and from what you learn, and that's pretty much a standard process of evolution. But when you're in that creative state and you no longer are aware that you have a body, you no longer are aware that there's people around you, or there's coffee brewing in the kitchen, or that you have pain in your back, or that you're in your home or in your bedroom, and you're no longer thinking about your appointments later in the day or what you have to do, what you did yesterday, that you're in the present moment. When you get into that elegant state of the present moment, and you become nobody, no one, no thing, nowhere, in no time, that's the moment you become pure consciousness. And that's the moment you begin to interact with this invisible field of information. And as you begin to interact with this invisible field of information, and we've recorded this, it's like the brain is downloading information no longer from its sensory perception, it's downloading information from the field. And we've seen this in enough cases. And all of a sudden the person gets an insight. All of a sudden the person gets a new idea. All of a sudden the person gets a vision. All of a sudden the person has a knowingness about something. All of a sudden the person is inspired by some type of possibility that they never thought of before. And that is the nervous system receiving information from a realm beyond the senses. Now this is that quantum moment, that download that's taking place, where it not only is just an insight, but it's an epiphany. It reaches every cell of the person's body, and they know information is true. They know it to be the truth. And they begin to trust that intuition. They begin to trust that vision. They begin to say, I know that in some way that this is my future. And they begin to make the necessary choices, demonstrate the right behaviors, create the right experiences that literally lead them into a new reality. So that kind of downloading of data that takes place from the field is taking place beyond our senses. It's taking place from the realm of the immaterial and not the material, because that moment that we become pure consciousness is the moment our consciousness begins to merge with the consciousness of the quantum field, which is an infinite field of intelligence. And that's when people start to trust themselves more, and that's when people start to live more healthier and more enriched lives.
How does the neuron impulses spreading the message?
Well, there's 100 billion neurons in the brain, as we said in the first show, and they fire in different sequences, patterns, and combinations. And so when you learn something new, you make a new connection. If you keep adding more information to what you're learning, the neurons begin to assemble into what's called neurological networks. Those neurological networks are kind of the hardware of the brain. But if you keep reviewing that information and firing and wiring those circuits, the hardware becomes a software program, and it becomes more of an automatic neurological network. So you have a neural network to brush your teeth, you have a neural network to drive your car, you have a neural network to speak a language or more than one language, and you will begin to access information in that stored neurological network. But the memory is not only stored in the brain is the pattern of information, kind of the downward causation, but that energy also, memory also exists in the field as well. So the person's accessing, by turning on that network, information from the field. But once the program, the neurological network, turns on, that neurological network runs automatically, and that becomes pretty much who a person is if they keep doing it. So that's why they can drive their car, drink coffee, text, talk, check the news, talk to their children in the back seat, shift gears. They have all these programs running because all those different automatic neurological networks are working at the same exact time. So being able to combine those neurological networks in different ways is what allows us the ability to create new levels of mind. So, as an example, we tell people that they have a lot of skills and things that they do really well in their lives. And we don't want them to eliminate any of that. We want them to take those propensities and characteristics, those skills and habits that are constructive, and use the same neurological networks to build new neurological networks so that they can begin to apply more enhanced information into their lives. So the combination of putting those neurological networks together, creating bigger levels of mind, applying those neurological networks to have greater experiences, begins to enrich the very gray matter of our brain because we're evolving who we are.
How does the chemical messengers create the connections?
Well, you know, there's that principle in neuroscience, it's called Hebbian learning. And Hebbian learning says that nerve cells that fire together wire together. So you learn a phone number, and someone tells you their 10-digit phone number, and then you repeat it to yourself. You recognize the first 3 digits because it's the same area code, or say, that you have. And then you kind of remember the next 3 numbers, and then you memorize the last 4 numbers. And you keep repeating the number over and over again, over and over again, over and over again, over and over again. And as you keep firing and wiring, firing and wiring, firing and wiring, you develop a neurological network that is that phone number. And so when you say, oh, what is my best friend's phone number, you see a picture of their face, and by association, all of a sudden the frontal lobe accesses that neurological network, and then it becomes more easy and more automatic for you to use. So the same thing applies if you have a neurological network to be wealthy, or successful, or healthy, or happy, or unlimited, or mystical, or spiritual, whatever it is. It's the process of assembling these levels of mind and keeping them alive, keeping them firing and wiring until they become integrated. And as they integrate more, that becomes your new way of being. You think that way, you act that way, and you feel that way. And how you think, how you act, and how you feel is called your personality. And your personality creates your personal reality. That's it. So then, most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. We literally have to become someone else.
What are the main types of neurotransmitters, and what are their function?
Well, we have excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate. That's one of the brain's major excitatory neurotransmitters. That kind of gets us up and going. It gets us stimulated. It excites neurological activity. And then we have inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA, G-A-B-A, that tends to inhibit neurological function. Now, we need both of those, because if you're going to pick up a cup and you only have glutamate activated and not GABA, when you pick that cup up, your hand will go straight up. So as you pick the cup up and you direct it towards your mouth, there's a process of excitatory and inhibitory chemistry going on, so you can direct it right to your mouth. So the brain is the balance between those excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. At the same time, we have other neurotransmitters like serotonin and melatonin. And serotonin is your daytime neurotransmitter. When you wake up in the morning and your eye begins to perceive light, the moment your eye begins to perceive light, the brain begins to activate the pineal gland, and the pineal gland begins to make this neurotransmitter called serotonin. And in serotonin, your brain waves pick up. For the most part, your attention is on your outer world. You're plugged into your environment, and it keeps you awake and keeps you paying attention. When the light of the day diminishes and there's less visible light happening, all of a sudden the pineal gland takes serotonin and turns it into melatonin. And melatonin is the nighttime neurotransmitter, and that puts us to sleep at night. So then if you keep this rhythm of waking up in the same environment going for an extended period of time, you create what's called the circadian rhythm. So all of a sudden your brain and body get entrained into the environment, and you wake up in the morning pretty much at the same time, your brain chemistry turns on, you start your day, and then as night starts to change and the light starts to go along with it, all of a sudden melatonin is created and your body gets in this kind of natural rhythm. The problem is that for most people, if they're living in stress and they're living in high levels of cortisol, the higher the person's levels of cortisol, the less amount of melatonin they make. And that's a very adaptive function in antiquity, because if you're stressed because there's a neighboring tribe that's warring, or there's a predator that's living close to your village, the very mechanism that's created from the hormones of stress and the higher cortisol levels is going to stop you from sleeping, which means you're going to have better chances of survival and you're going to stay awake. It's kind of a primitive mechanism. The problem is that people spend so much time living with high cortisol levels that they don't sleep, and their melatonin levels go down, and melatonin is strongly associated with a lot of the body's innate ability to repair and regenerate. We also have neurotransmitters like dopamine, which activate pleasure centers in the brain. Like if you're thinking about having a nice warm cup of coffee with the right type of milk and the mocha and however you like your coffee, as you begin to look forward to drinking that coffee, you turn on dopamine. Or if you're going to see a lover or a husband or a wife or seeing one of your children, as you get excited or think about seeing them in anticipation, you begin to produce higher levels of dopamine. Then there's ones like acetylcholine that just really, for the most part, have to do with memory formation and just levels of cognition and rationale. But each one of those neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that produce different functions in the brain.
You mentioned the glutamate, and in Romania we have a problem with food products which some of them contains too much glutamate, and in time this substance accumulates in the body and perturbs the neuroimpulses.
Well, that's true, because glutamate is a great binder to certain salts, and glutamate is an excitatory chemical. So a lot of times when people are consuming flavor enhancers or preservatives that have glutamate in it, it kind of heightens the threshold of excitability in their nervous system, and it could give them headaches or insomnia or not make them feel as well, because the flavor enhancer is overactivating the glutamate pathways in the brain. And a lot of times people don't even know that they're consuming glutamate because so many foods and so many processed foods have those flavor enhancers in there, so it can stimulate the brain. So not only is it creating a better taste, but you're combining the better taste with an excitatory function. So the person eats the French fries or eats the sautéed Chinese food or whatever, and all of a sudden they like the taste, but along with liking the taste, the brain gets a little aroused. And as it gets a little bit aroused and it starts to feel more awake for a short period of time, that person is going to crave that food whenever their brain chemistry starts to change, and you create a dependency just with flavor enhancers.
There are a lot of interesting information in your book about neurology. Please tell us about the types of nervous systems and how they work.
Wow, okay. You've done your homework. Well, you have your central nervous system, and this is just basic information. Your central nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. Your central nervous system controls and coordinates all other systems in your body. You couldn't digest your food. You couldn't move a muscle. You couldn't void your bladder. You couldn't react to certain chemicals with your immune system without the aid of your nervous system. So your nervous system, the central nervous system is like the electrical wires that run the machine. You have a brain, and the spinal cord is an extension of the brain. And so that's the main processing unit. And wherever you have the most number of neurons clustered together, you have the greatest capacity to learn, remember, and function. So then off the central nervous system, you have what's called peripheral nerves. And those are nerves that connect to the central nervous system that send and carry information to different parts of the body. So some of those nerves, peripheral nerves, are for the most part voluntary nerves, like if I'm going to make a muscle or if I'm going to stand up, I use the peripheral nerves for a voluntary function. We also have peripheral nerves that are involuntary nerves. In other words, some message is coming from a part of my brain that's digesting my food and filtering blood, and that's happening behind the scenes of my awareness. And that involuntary function that takes place in the body is under the auspices or under the guidance of the autonomic nervous system. And autonomic means automatic. And so that exists under the thinking neocortex, and it's about the size of an apricot, and it has a bunch of substructures that controls body temperature, that controls appetite, that controls digestion, hormonal levels, blood sugar levels, and all of that's happening behind the scenes of our awareness. So as the autonomic nervous system stays in balance, the person maintains a high degree of health. If the autonomic nervous system is consistently moved out of balance because of the hormones of stress, that imbalance becomes the new balance, and now the person is headed for disease. So the integration of these different nervous systems in working together for the body to work more holistically is a great definition of health.
Please tell us shortly about the myth of the gene controls and how can we rewrite the genes using educated behavior?
Well, the first lie that we've ever been taught and been programmed by is that genes create disease. Less than 1% of people on the planet are born with genetic conditions like Tay-Sachs disease or sickle cell anemia or type 1 diabetes. The other 95 to 99% is created from lifestyle and behaviors. Now, genes are like Christmas tree lights. They turn on and off all the time. And when they turn on and they become activated or regulated, that's called upregulation. When they turn off or they shut down, that's called downregulation. Now, what most people don't know is that the body is a protein-producing machine. Muscle cells make muscle proteins called actin and myosin. Your immune system makes immune proteins called antibodies. Your stomach cells make stomach proteins called enzymes. Your eye cells make eye proteins called keratin. And your body is a protein-producing machine. Now, proteins are responsible for the structure and the function of your body. And so then in order for any cell in your body to make a protein, a gene has to be regulated. So, for the most part, people live their life every single day 90% of the time thinking the same way, acting the same way, and feeling the same way. And because there's no new information coming from any new experience, they kind of keep the same genes on and the other genes turned off, and they're headed for some type of genetic destiny. So then, the latest research shows that when you begin to behave differently and you master a behavior, you release what's called behavior-dependent genes, or you activate the behavior-dependent genes. If you have a new experience and that experience has a threshold of emotion that's heightened, you will begin to instruct and select what's called experience-dependent genes, and both those behavior-dependent genes and those experience-dependent genes are passed on to the very next generation. So when the scientists began to map the human genome, Christian, they said, okay, the body is made up of about 100,000 proteins, so there should be 100,000 genes for each one of those proteins. It takes 40,000 additional proteins to begin to make those 100,000 proteins, so there should be 40,000 more genes for those regulatory proteins. So 100,000 proteins, 100,000 genes plus 40,000 genes is 140,000 genes. So the scientists said 140,000 proteins, there should be 140,000 genes for each one of these proteins. When they mapped the human... 23,000, little over 23,000 genes. So then the question is, how could we have more proteins than genes that make those proteins? Because in one gene, we can have over 3,000 variations on one individual sequence. And so then as the gene begins to get new information, the chemical signature or this chemical instruction that's happening outside of the environment of the cell is knocking on the genetic door that begins to select and instruct the new gene to make a new protein. So then, for the most part, if most people are embracing the same experiences, demonstrating the same behaviors, living by the same emotional reactions, they're keeping the same genes on and the other genes turned off, and now they're headed for some type of genetic destiny. So then what if you understood, if you can have people begin to think differently, begin to act differently, begin to feel differently, to begin to experience new things, and they're able to change their very genetic expression, is it possible then that once they program that new gene, is it possible for them to become healthy? And so that is the model we use to understand how so many people in our work have healed themselves of cancer, that have healed themselves of diabetes, of rheumatoid arthritis, of MS, of lupus, of rare genetic disorders, of endocrine conditions, because for the most part, they understood that they were their own genetic engineers. And genes do not create disease. And when people say genes control our destiny, they've given their power away to really begin to change their lives. And so we teach people how to literally begin to express new genetic potentials, and they become their own personal genetic engineers.
Because we are approaching the end of the interview, please tell us about the second event that you are planning to do in Romania, Bucharest, on March 2017.
Well, we do workshops, what we call progressive workshops, all over the world. We do them in London, we do them in Barcelona, we do them in Paris, we do them in Milan, we do them in Rome, we do them in Munich, we do them in Hamburg, we do them in Amsterdam, all throughout the United States, Mexico City, Canada, Australia, Sydney, Melbourne. We do these progressive workshops pretty much around the world. And these progressive workshops really are an opportunity for people to go from this knowledge, this philosophy, to initiating it into experience, to ultimately begin to create a new state of being or master that information. And so it's a Friday night, all day Saturday, and all day Sunday. And it's an opportunity for people to retreat from their lives and to begin to learn some vital information about what science says about possibility, and combine a little neuroplasticity with a little quantum physics and epigenetics, and give people the understandings, and then right after they understand that information, they go right into an experience. And then after that experience, then, we give them more information, they build on the last one, and we keep progressing the model. And these, if you come to the event, you will be in and out of meditation the entire weekend. You'll learn how to change a belief or perception about yourself and your life. You'll understand what it means to find the sweet spot of the generous present moment and to practice what it means to be present. We will teach you, for the most part, how to tune into a potential that already exists in the quantum field by changing your electromagnetic energy to match some possibility that already exists, and you'll understand the science behind that. We will show the research that we've done on a lot of students, what we call supernatural results, to show people that it's entirely possible for them to create the miraculous, or at least the healing in their lives. We will also teach people how to change their body as their mind and then recondition their body to a new mind. And we will finish the event with what we call the blessing of the energy centers, which has become one of the most popular meditations in our community. And so this is an event for doers. We will be doing quite a bit of work, and we'll be in and out of meditation the entire weekend. And I promise you that if you come, you'll leave feeling very differently than when you arrived.